Banned from the Bible. Why was Book of Jubilees removed? Biblical wisdom. Have you ever stopped to think about how the Bible was formed? The Holy Scriptures we read today didn't simply appear out of nowhere. They were the product of centuries of careful selection, debate, and sometimes exclusion. But what if I told you that there's a book that almost made it into the Bible? A book that was widely respected, influential, and even referenced by some of the early Christian and Jewish communities, but was ultimately removed. This book is the Book of Jubilees, and its story is one of mystery, controversy, and untold significance. Now, imagine for a moment that you lived in a time when various sacred texts were being considered for inclusion in the Bible. You're reading about Genesis, Exodus, the Law, and Prophets, but in the background, there's another text, almost like an alternate version of the Bible, explaining things in a different way. It's more structured. It divides history into jubilees, cycles of 49 years. It's rich in details about creation, the laws of Moses, and even angels. The Book of Jubilees offers an expanded narrative of Genesis and Exodus, but with a twist. This twist would become the very reason it was excluded from the Bible. This is a book that doesn't just reflect the Old Testament's events. It adds depth to them, shedding light on obscure passages, filling in gaps, and providing a systematic way to view the world. Some early Jewish communities, especially the Essenes, you may know them from the Dead Sea Scrolls, saw it as an important part of their faith. It was read, discussed, and even copied with reverence. But despite its popularity in certain circles, the Book of Jubilees never found its place in the official Jewish or Christian canon. It was banned, removed, and ultimately left out of the sacred scriptures. But why? Was it too radical for the time? Did it challenge established beliefs? Was its message too controversial for the religious authorities who were shaping the Bible? To understand why the Book of Jubilees was excluded, we have to go beyond simple theological differences. We need to understand the history behind its rise, the theological debates surrounding it, and the political forces that influenced the canonization process. The exclusion of this book wasn't just a theological decision. It was deeply connected to the ongoing struggles between different Jewish sects, the early Christian church, and the larger political powers at the time. In this video, we'll explore the story of the Book of Jubilees, its origins, why it was so important to certain groups, and why it ultimately didn't make it into the Bible. We'll dive into its key themes, how it challenges traditional views of creation, law, and angels, and the complex reasons why it was set aside, even though it was highly regarded by many early believers. So, grab your Bible, open your mind, and let's dive into this fascinating story of what could have been a pivotal part of the Bible, and why it was ultimately banned. Part 1. What is the Book of Jubilees? Alright, now that we've set the stage, let's dive into what the Book of Jubilees actually is. So, picture this, you're sitting in the time of early Judaism, around 160 BCE, and you have a book that's rewriting key parts of Genesis and Exodus. But this isn't just another retelling. The Book of Jubilees takes everything and reorders it into a neat, structured timeline. It breaks history into jubilees, which are cycles of 49 years. So instead of a more organic, somewhat ambiguous timeline like you find in Genesis, the Book of Jubilees offers a very precise, orderly account of creation and the events that follow. It starts off with the creation of the world, but with a twist. Instead of just saying, God created the heavens and the earth, the Book of Jubilees goes into a lot more detail, almost as if it's filling in the gaps of the Genesis story. It focuses on a detailed structure of time. Again, this idea of jubilees, 49-year cycles that bring a sense of rhythm and divine order to the unfolding of history. These jubilees are more than just a timeline. They're a way of understanding history itself. They divide events like creation, the flood, and Israel's history into neat periods of time, giving everything a clear beginning, middle, and end. What's even more fascinating is how it reshapes the idea of God's laws. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes the importance of following these laws in a way that makes it feel like the divine order is part of a much larger cosmic plan. The book takes what was in the Torah and spells out the significance of every action, every law, and every festival, pretty much as if it's making sure you don't miss anything. It's detailed to the point that it even gives a structured calendar to help you follow those laws. That's why many early Jewish communities were so drawn to it, especially groups like the Essenes who were focused on strict observance of the law. And then there's the role of angels. Angels in the Book of Jubilees are not just passive bystanders. They're active participants in the story of creation. Some angels are even given credit for helping humanity learn essential things, like agriculture or knowledge about the heavens. For many in the early Jewish world, this was a fresh take on the divine order. It offered a glimpse into a much larger cosmic battle between good and evil, with angels playing a very hands-on role in shaping humanity's destiny. So, to sum it up, the Book of Jubilees offers a very unique perspective on the biblical story. It takes the same characters we know, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and gives them new depth. But it also creates a completely different framework for understanding time, creation, and divine order. It was, in many ways, a book that was ahead of its time in terms of structure and how it portrayed God's role in the universe. Part 2. The Rise and Popularity of the Book of Jubilees. Alright, now we know what the Book of Jubilees is, but let's talk about why it was so important, especially in the early Jewish world. You see, the Book of Jubilees didn't just appear out of nowhere. It rose to prominence during a time of great upheaval. The Jewish people were living under the shadow of the Seleucid Empire. This was during the time of the Maccabean Revolt, which was essentially a fight for religious freedom against the forced spread of Hellenistic culture. The Jewish people were facing pressure to adopt Greek ways, and that included Greek gods, Greek philosophies, and Greek practices. In this environment, the Book of Jubilees came across as a pillar of resistance, a statement of Jewish identity, and a reminder of their connection to God's laws. The book emphasized the importance of following God's commandments in the face of external pressures. It was popular among certain Jewish sects, especially the Essenes, the same group who later gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were the folks who were all about strict law observance, and they saw in the Book of Jubilees a valuable way to reinforce their devotion to God's ways. But it wasn't just the Essenes who liked the book. Other Jewish communities, too, found value in its clear and structured approach to faith. The Book of Jubilees helped organize time itself. By breaking history into jubilees, it helped believers tie their lives directly to the divine timetable. Imagine if every year you were reminded of your sacred duties, your festivals, your laws, all laid out in a way that told you exactly when to do what. That's what the Book of Jubilees offered. A divine calendar that synchronized God's commands with your daily life. In fact, this book became so influential that it was included in many of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran. And it's clear that these ancient communities held it in high regard. It wasn't just a book of stories. It was seen as a guidebook for living out the law, understanding God's divine plan, and staying connected to the Jewish faith. But this popularity also became the reason it faced controversy down the road. The Book of Jubilees had a way of creating boundaries. It was very specific about how one should live, when to worship, what to follow, and in doing so, it began to diverge from what others in the Jewish world considered acceptable. Now, while the Book of Jubilees was cherished by these groups, it wasn't universally accepted. There were competing religious ideas about what should be considered sacred, and the Book of Jubilees wasn't always in line with the more mainstream views. It was, in some ways, too specific about the law, about the role of angels, and about how history should be structured. This idea of angels being involved in every major event of creation didn't sit well with everyone. It raised some theological eyebrows. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Just know that, for a while, the Book of Jubilees was widely read and respected. It had a strong following among early Jews, especially those who felt like they needed to guard their traditions against outside influence. But it wasn't long before other forces would step in and ultimately prevent the Book of Jubilees from being included in the official canon of Scripture. Part 3. theological and political tensions. So, why was the Book of Jubilees removed from the Bible? This is where the story gets interesting and a little complicated. The exclusion of the Book of Jubilees wasn't just about a theological disagreement over details. It was about control of the narrative, control of how people should understand the Bible, and control of religious identity in a time when the Jewish and early Christian communities were both finding their footing in a changing world. One of the major theological issues was its emphasis on angels. As I mentioned before, the Book of Jubilees presents angels as not just heavenly beings but active participants in creation and history. They're almost like co-creators intervening in human affairs. While the Bible does mention angels, they're not as involved in the narrative as they are in the Book of Jubilees. This angelology or theology of angels was seen as too much of a departure from what other religious leaders were comfortable with. The idea that angels played such an integral role was seen as problematic because it seemed to undermine God's sole authority in the process of creation and history. Then there's the issue of the calendar and the Book of Jubilees' strict adherence to a 364-day year. Now, I know that might sound a bit strange, but this calendar was a huge deal. It was very specific, and in many ways, it clashed with the more flexible lunar-based calendar that was used in the rest of the Jewish world. This rigid structure of time, while offering clarity for the followers of the Book of Jubilees, didn't fit with the traditions of the Jewish people as a whole. It introduced divisions between different Jewish groups, and in a time when unity was a priority, that was a major problem. Politically speaking, the process of forming the Bible's canon wasn't just about theology. It was about who held power and who got to decide what was considered sacred. In the early stages of canonization, both Jewish and Christian authorities were attempting to solidify their power and influence. The Book of Jubilees, while widely respected by certain groups, didn't fit with the emerging authority structures. It was too specific, too rigid, and too tied to a particular sect of Judaism. The decision to exclude the Book of Jubilees from the Bible was also influenced by the need to streamline religious teachings. There was a desire to create a more uniform faith, one that was easier to follow and that could unite believers. The Book of Jubilees' complex system of laws, calendars, and angelology didn't help with that goal. It created more questions than answers for the religious authorities who were trying to set a standard for belief. And this, my friends, is why the Book of Jubilees was ultimately left out of the canon. It was the product of a time of great theological and political tension, and while it offered deep insights into creation and the divine, it was seen as too controversial for the religious leaders of the time to accept. This section helps set up the reason for the Book of Jubilees' exclusion and dives into the theological and political factors at play. Let me know if you'd like to continue the next parts or refine any section further. Part 4, the Book of Jubilees and the Early Christian Church. Now that we've explored the rise and popularity of the Book of Jubilees in early Judaism, let's shift our focus to how it was viewed in the early Christian Church. This is where things get even more fascinating because, when you think about it, early Christianity was still in its formative years, and the debates over what constituted Scripture were in full swing. In the early days of Christianity, church leaders were just beginning to figure out which books should be included in the New Testament, but they were also revisiting the Old Testament. The early Christians inherited a lot from their Jewish roots, and many of them would have been familiar with the Book of Jubilees, especially since it had such a strong presence among the early Jewish sections. But as Christianity began to establish its own identity, tensions started to rise over which texts were seen as truly aligned with the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. One of the reasons the Book of Jubilees never found its place in the Christian canon had to do with its emphasis on the law and its portrayal of angels. The early Christian church was rapidly developing a theology that was centered around Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of the law, and the new covenant. The Book of Jubilees, with its meticulous focus on Old Testament laws and angels, didn't align with the new understanding of salvation through Christ alone. It was as though the Book of Jubilees was too focused on the old way of thinking, while Christianity was starting to build a new, transformative vision that emphasized grace over the law. Church fathers like Origen and Jerome were key figures in the early Christian canon debate. Origen, for example, was known for his extensive work on biblical texts, but even he did not consider the Book of Jubilees to be part of the Christian tradition. His reasons were rooted in the fact that the book seemed to focus too much on the physical laws of Judaism, rather than on spiritual truths that pointed to Christ. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, we know it as the Vulgate, also dismissed the Book of Jubilees. He believed that it did not reflect the teachings of the apostles or align with the message of salvation through Jesus. But it wasn't just the theological content that made the Book of Jubilees problematic for the early Christian church. It was also its origins. Christianity was developing its own identity, separate from the Jewish faith, and texts like the Book of Jubilees, which were so closely tied to Jewish law and customs, didn't fit the new Christian narrative. In a time when early Christians were trying to distance themselves from traditional Jewish practices, a book that reaffirmed the Jewish calendar, laws, and the centrality of angels in divine action just wasn't going to make it. It was almost as if the Book of Jubilees was a symbol of a more Jewish way of understanding Scripture, which wasn't as appealing to Christians who were defining themselves as a new movement. For Christians in the first few centuries, the focus needed to be on Jesus as the fulfillment of the law, and the Book of Jubilees didn't fit into that narrative. The early church needed books that helped explain how Jesus was the key to salvation and how the Old Testament pointed toward him. The Book of Jubilees, in its strict adherence to the old laws, didn't provide that bridge between the old and the new. So, while some early Christian leaders might have had access to or been familiar with the Book of Jubilees, it was ultimately pushed aside in favor of books that aligned more directly with the emerging Christian identity. The Book of Jubilees was essentially left behind as the Christian church developed its canon and doctrine, shaped by its evolving theology and its desire to focus on the teachings of Christ. Part 5. The Council of Jamnia and the Jewish Canon. Now, we need to step back in time a little and look at the Council of Jamnia, a key moment in the history of how the Hebrew Bible was finalized. The Council of Jamnia, held around 90 CE, was an unofficial gathering of Jewish scholars who were discussing which books should be considered sacred and included in the Jewish canon. At this time, the Jewish people were under Roman rule, and their religious leaders were concerned with establishing a unified canon that could serve as the foundation for the Jewish faith moving forward. One of the most significant things about the Council of Jamnia was that it was primarily focused on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. These books were seen as central to Jewish identity and religious practice. But in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and the dispersion of Jewish communities, there was a strong desire to solidify and preserve the scriptures that would continue to guide the Jewish people. And as you can imagine, this wasn't a simple process. The question of which books were authoritative and worthy of inclusion in the canon was hotly debated. This is where the Book of Jubilees comes into play. While some early Jewish communities saw it as an important text, the book ultimately didn't make the cut for inclusion in the canon, and one of the reasons was because of its focus on the law and its divergence from what would become the standard Jewish texts. The Book of Jubilees was highly focused on Jewish law, the calendar, and the role of angels, which made it seem like a niche text that only appealed to a specific group of Jews. It didn't offer a universal view that would resonate with the broader Jewish population, particularly those who wanted to maintain a more simplified and unified canon. Moreover, the Jewish leadership at the time was also concerned with political unity. They wanted a canon that could help solidify the Jewish community's identity in the face of Roman oppression. So, the focus on books that were directly tied to Jewish life and worship, especially the Torah, was crucial. The Book of Jubilees was seen as too sectarian, too focused on a particular group's interpretation of the law, and too complicated in its structure of time and angels. For the leaders of Jamnia, the canon needed to be streamlined and relevant to the majority of Jewish people, not something that would create further divisions. This is why the Book of Jubilees, despite its popularity in certain Jewish circles, was ultimately excluded from the canon. It didn't align with the broader vision of what the Jewish faith needed in that moment. Instead, the Jewish canon would focus on texts that spoke to a broader, more unified vision of Jewish life. Texts that centered on the Torah and that could be understood by all Jews, regardless of sect. Part 6. What was lost with the exclusion of the Book of Jubilees? So, here we are, after all the debates, theological disagreements, and political pressures, the Book of Jubilees was excluded from both the Jewish and Christian canons. But the question remains, what was lost when this book was removed from the Bible? Was it just another ancient text? Or was it something more? Well, the exclusion of the Book of Jubilees represents the loss of a unique perspective on the creation story, the role of angels, and the divine order of time. The Book of Jubilees gave us a very structured view of history, one that saw all events as part of a divinely ordained timeline. This wasn't just a history book. It was a way to understand the world. It offered a cosmic vision of God's plan, where every action was purposeful and part of a grand divine design. That sense of order and timing was something that resonated deeply with early Jewish communities. And for many, it was an essential part of understanding their place in the world. The Book of Jubilees also gave us a detailed understanding of the Jewish calendar, how time itself was a form of worship, and how every festival had deep spiritual significance. For those who lived by the rhythms of the Jewish festivals, the Book of Jubilees was an invaluable resource, something that helped them stay in sync with the divine order. By excluding it, something was lost in understanding the spiritual significance of time itself and how it relates to God's plan. But perhaps the most significant loss was the sense of continuity it provided between the Old and New Testaments. The Book of Jubilees was a link between the Hebrew Scriptures and the emerging Christian tradition. It offered a bridge showing how everything, from the law to the angels, pointed toward something greater. When this book was excluded, it created a gap in the understanding of how the Old Testament related to the New. It was a text that could have helped clarify the relationship between the two, but it was left behind in favor of a more streamlined canon that focused on the centrality of the law, prophecy, and Christ's fulfillment of them. Part 7. What was lost with the exclusion of the Book of Jubilees? So, after everything we've discussed, the rise of the Book of Jubilees, the tensions surrounding its theology, and its eventual exclusion, one question remains. What exactly was lost when this book was removed from the Bible? And more importantly, why should we care today? Let me take you back to the core idea of the Book of Jubilees. It's a book that provided structure. It gave a divine sense of order to the history of the world. By dividing time into Jubilees, 49-year cycles, the Book of Jubilees presented a world where everything had its appointed time, where every moment in history was part of a divine narrative. Imagine if we saw our own lives like that. Not random, not chaotic, but part of a larger, perfectly ordered design. That's what this book offered to early Jewish communities, and it's why they held it so dear. But more than that, the Book of Jubilees made it easier to live in that order. It outlined the laws, explained the festivals, and gave divine meaning to every part of the year. For the communities that adhered strictly to religious observances, this wasn't just a nice framework, it was a lifeline. It provided an anchor for how they lived every single day. The festivals weren't just random traditions, they were events tied to the divine plan. When the Book of Jubilees was removed from the Bible, we lost a resource that connected people to God in every moment of their lives, no matter the time of year. Think about how the Christian faith today also talks about living according to God's will. The Book of Jubilees shared a similar sentiment, but in a more structured way. It would have added depth to our understanding of the Old Testament and, by extension, the New Testament too. The idea that every event in history had a purpose tied to God's divine will could have deepened our understanding of Christ's role in fulfilling that plan. By losing the Book of Jubilees, the connection between Old and New Testament ideas of time, law, and salvation became more fragmented. And lastly, don't forget that the Book of Jubilees didn't just deal with laws and calendars. It also gave us a deeper understanding of the role of angels, heavenly messengers who play an essential part in God's plan. In fact, it's one of the few texts that gives such detailed attention to the role of angels in creation. Today, we might think of angels as being present only during key moments like the birth of Jesus or the Annunciation to Mary. But in Jubilees, they were involved throughout the divine order, acting as guardians, teachers, and messengers. So, the loss of the Book of Jubilees meant the loss of a more holistic vision of creation, where every part of the universe had its divine purpose. Whether it's the laws of Moses, the role of angels, or the rhythm of time itself, this book helped believers understand that God's design wasn't just abstract or distant. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives. Part 8. The Book of Jubilees in Modern Scholarship. Now, let's talk about how the Book of Jubilees has been rediscovered in modern times. As we're learning more about the past, especially with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this book is coming back into the spotlight in a major way. For centuries, the Book of Jubilees was pretty much left out of discussions in religious circles. But with the growth of biblical scholarship and the rise of historical criticism, scholars are starting to revisit this once-forgotten book and asking, what does this tell us about early Jewish thought? When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 20th century, among those texts were fragments of the Book of Jubilees. This discovery was a game-changer because it showed just how influential the book was among certain Jewish communities. In fact, these texts revealed that the Book of Jubilees wasn't just popular. It was vital to certain groups. The Essenes, the group most famously associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, held this book in high regard. They saw it as a guide to holy living, much like other Jewish communities valued the Torah. Now, here's where it gets even more fascinating. By studying the Book of Jubilees alongside other ancient texts, scholars are able to get a clearer picture of how early Jewish thought developed. There's a lot we can learn about the way Jewish communities viewed creation, law, and divine intervention by examining this book. It sheds light on how people at the time understood time itself, how they thought about their relationship to God, and how they lived in accordance with divine will. These insights help us better understand the Bible itself. What's more, scholars are finding that the Book of Jubilees is a bridge, a text that connects not just the Old and New Testaments, but also early Jewish beliefs with Christian theology. For instance, the emphasis on angels and divine order in the Book of Jubilees provides us with deeper context for understanding the role of angels in Christian thought. The book doesn't just serve as a window into Jewish history, it helps us understand the theological development that would eventually influence Christianity. And guess what? The Book of Jubilees is not just for scholars and theologians. It's relevant for anyone who wants to understand the rich, diverse history of the Bible and how its canon came to be. By engaging with this book, modern readers can better appreciate the history of their faith and the complex ways God's truth has been communicated over time. For example, think about how serious the early Christian and Jewish communities were about the canon. They didn't just pick books randomly. They chose texts that would help shape their faith and understanding of God's plan. The Book of Jubilees, though excluded from the canon, offers us a deeper view into that very process. By studying it, we gain a better sense of what could have been part of our sacred text, and why it ultimately wasn't. Part 9, Final Thoughts. Why understanding the Book of Jubilees still matters. As we wrap up, let me leave you with a few final thoughts. The Book of Jubilees, though not part of the Bible, is more than just a historical artifact. It's a lens through which we can understand the development of faith and the evolving relationship between humanity and God. Understanding the Book of Jubilees helps us see how early Jewish and Christian communities wrestled with difficult theological questions, how they sought to understand time, creation, and the divine order. You might be wondering, so, why does this matter today? Well, for one, it opens up a conversation about what it means to be part of God's story. The Book of Jubilees invites us to reflect on how we live our lives in harmony with God's plan. Whether it's through following divine law or understanding the times and seasons of our lives, This book teaches us that every part of our lives has meaning within God's greater design. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that our faith isn't just about accepting what we've been given. It's about engaging with the past, questioning, studying, and seeking to understand God's plan more deeply. The fact that the Book of Jubilees was excluded from the canon doesn't make it irrelevant. It means we need to engage with it even more thoughtfully to uncover the deeper layers of history and theology that shaped our faith. So, the next time you open your Bible and reflect on creation, the law, or the role of angels, take a moment to remember the Book of Jubilees. Think about how it would have shaped our understanding of those ideas if it had been included. And remember, our faith today is built on a rich history of books, debates, and decisions. Some we understand, and some we still have yet to fully grasp.